We are on chapter 20 in world history, and we're talking about British imperialism, that time of England and settling in all these different areas of the world. And definitely there was a blending of the East and West. England usually tried to respect the religious customs and traditions of India, but also introduced the Indians to modern conveniences such as railroads, telegraphs, and improved agricultural methods. So England brought in a lot as they came into India, and actually through the East India Company, they had to come in to protect the English people. England ended up controlling all of India. So, and then came in Christianity. With Christianity, the Bible became the written language and the education and literature, plus humane treatment of the people of India, were all brought in by the Christian missionaries into India. And this would be surely a blending of the East and West, and the old with the new. So, India. From India, we go into Africa, some other countries here. We're going to be talking a lot about South Africa and the area of Sahara. We're going to go in through the Nile and the Congo and these areas as the British came in to many of these areas in Africa. Well, Africa remained an unexplored mystery, a dark continent, because so little was known. European explorers did go into the interior, but this task was extremely difficult due to intense heat, dense vegetation, and fearsome tropical diseases. The diseases such as malaria, yellow fever, and sleeping sickness were very harsh. In fact, they called this area the white man's grave. The West Coast was named as the white man's grave, because so many white men that went into Africa died of these things, especially malaria. The dark continent, Africa. So here we have a picture of the African colonies, and this was in 1884. And I just put this in there because you can see not only as the British went in, they took over a lot of these areas that are in orange. This was the British area. The French was in this area, some Spanish, Italian over here, German, Portuguese, German. You can see almost all of Africa was colonized by European countries, except for two countries. This little country, which was Liberia, was a free country, and the free country that actually Americans, we'll talk about that, Americans actually brought in the freedom of slaves and made it a country where freed slaves could go. And then on to the old country of Ethiopia, which was in the high mountains. And so it was protected there. Those are the only two free areas of Africa during this time. Could you believe that? Even Madagascar, even down this area. Slave trade hostility. There was intense hostility and hatred due to what? Slave trade. The Portuguese slave trade began in the 1500s when Portugal started exploring those areas. But the Portuguese were not the first. The Arabs had bought and sold slaves for centuries. The Portuguese brought the slave trade, though, to Europe and to the New World, giving a large slave market. Africans themselves even bought and sold each other with shocking readiness, and so the Portuguese would come in and the Africans would actually sell people to the Portuguese at that time, and sell them to other parts of Africa, other Africans, and to Arabs. Well, the native African chiefs raided other tribes and abducted men, women, and children to sell to Arab and Portuguese slave traders. You can see here's Portuguese here and the slave traders. You can see and how terrible this slave trade was. Horrific conditions of the slaves. The slave traders packed captives into ships, which the ships were dark and dirty and crowded and inhumane. Here's one of the pictures here, as you can see. Then they resold them to people in Asia, Europe, and in the New World in America, and brought many African slaves. Many African slaves even owned slaves and even caught them for slave traders, as we already mentioned. But slavery in Africa was despised. The traffic of human beings was a cruel, despicable occupation. But Africa was a beautiful treasure. So Africans suspected any white men. So when white men started coming in, they suspected, oh, there are slave traders. So everyone that went in was considered a possible slave trader. The explorers and missionaries, even missionaries as they went in were considered, they may be slave traders. So there was that problem of bringing the gospel there. This made exploration and evangelism even more difficult. But one thing was certain, Africa contained many wonderful natural resources and had it was like a vast treasure chest to be opened. Diamonds existed and all kinds of natural resources and animals, exotic animals. So Europeans wanted to go there despite the problems. So the early explorers in Africa, who were they? Well, the early explorers, besides the Portuguese coming into the areas of the ports, who would go into this dark continent? Needless to say, they were missionaries. Scottish Christians blazed the trail for exploring and bringing the gospel to Africa. Presbyterian Scotsmen were the explorers of this dark continent. We have a few here. We have James Bruce, 1768 to 1773, explored the source of the Blue Nile. Mungo Park traced the Niger River, the third longest river. And then Hugh Clapperton, 1822 to 1824, was the first European to cross the Sahara Desert and also discovered Lake Chad. Alexander Lang, and he was living 1825 to 1826, and he was the first European to reach the post of Timbuktu. Have you ever heard, where are you going to? Timbuktu is like the farthest place you could go. Timbuktu is deep in the interior. So here we have their pictures, I think this one up here is Mungo Park, yep. And then we have down towards here, the first to cross the desert. Here, this one here actually I think is David Livingstone, but let's see, James Bruce and Hugh Clapperton. African missionaries, a great field of harvest. So as these missionaries went in, they thought there's so many people here that need to hear about Jesus in these native areas. They do not know, some have never heard the gospel ever. And so it was a wide mission field, and these men were definitely great missionaries. The missionaries were the first great explorers. They were the first great teachers. They were the first great statesmen and peacemakers that Africa ever had. They stood up for the Africans when traders attempted to take advantage of them. The missionaries stood up against slave trade. They put many of the African languages into writing and translated the Bible into 500 of Africa's 800 languages. They helped bring an end to the inhumane and cruel slave trade and bloody tribal wars. And they established churches, schools, hospitals, and they trained African Christians to take part in all of these ministries. So it wasn't they just brought in these things and said, hey, we'll control you. They trained the Africans to actually control, be in control of all of these things. Above all, the missionaries led countless Africans to Jesus Christ and discipled them in the Word of God, delivering them from fear, superstition, and the bondage of native religions. So the gospel went out to Africa. Robert Moffat was a missionary pioneer, one of the first missionaries going into Africa. And again, he was another Scotsman. Remember I said many Scotsmen, they were the first pioneers. Well, this Scotsman was one of the first missionaries to Africa. He and his wife Mary settled in South Africa. And they ministered for 50 years, leading many Africans to Jesus Christ in South Africa. Moffat put the spoken language to written form and worked out the grammar, and he translated the Bible and the book Pilgrim's Progress, have you heard of that book? To the native tongues, so the Africans could read the Bible and could read Pilgrim's Progress. Amazing feat, amazing feat. So David Livingstone, who lived in 1813 to 1873, David Livingstone, and he was a missionary explorer. He was a young Scottish physician, doctor, who went to Africa in response to Robert Moffat's call for the missionaries to penetrate Africa's interior. So Robert Moffat had gone back to England and said, hey, we have an open field for missionaries here. And David Livingstone decided, being a doctor, he would go there. So Moffat said, I can see the smoke of 1,000 villages where the name of Christ has never been heard. So Livingstone joined the Moffats first in South Africa in 1841. I love this picture here, teaching the Bible. Livingstone made a few journeys through some really dark areas. His first journey, he discovered Lake Ngami, Zambezi River. He was the first European to see the smoke that thunders the Victoria Falls, beautiful falls there. Africa's largest falls, in fact. And then the British press coming back, they applauded him as, look at David Livingstone's coming back, and he's sharing all these wonderful places in Africa. Livingstone, he viewed in relation to my calling, the end of the geographical feat is only the beginning of the enterprise. So what was he saying? He was saying, viewed in the relation, God has called me here. The end is not just a geographical thing that I'm doing, is finding all these rivers and mapping things out. That's only the beginning of the enterprise. My enterprise, he was saying, is the gospel. Livingstone's calling was to open the vast heartland of Africa to the gospel. Here's a picture of him. He was attacked by a lion. So Henry Stanley, he's an American. Can you believe this? We're talking about an American deciding to go and follow up on David Livingstone. Well, Henry Stanley had to find Livingstone. So Livingstone's explorations had stopped suddenly, and nobody knew where David Livingstone was. And so an American newspaper reporter, a young man, decided to go to Africa to find him. His name was Henry Stanley. And after months of searching, he finally came upon a seriously ill Livingstone, David Livingstone, in a remote village near Lake Tanganyika on November 1871. So here we have a picture of Stanley meeting David Livingstone. Although I don't know if that picture is totally correct because it says he was very ill. So greeting him, you'll hear Stanley saying the famous words, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Who else would be there? He was the only white man there, He came upon him and said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, this American reporter. And then what happened then is so magnificent as David Livingstone leads Henry Stanley to Jesus. He was won to Christ by Livingstone's testimony. And later on, we find Henry Stanley comes back to Africa and follows in the footsteps as a missionary explorer, just like David Livingstone. Isn't that wonderful? A reporter comes, he gets saved, then he comes back and reports on everything and decides that he's now going to go and take his place and be a missionary. I love that story. In 1874 to 1877, Henry Stanley traced the great Congo River to its mouth into the South Atlantic Ocean. So he mapped out this dark area of jungles in Africa. So now when David Livingstone died, the Africans buried his heart in the jungle and then carried his body to the coast, which took like a year long to get him to the coast, his body. And then he was buried in London the rest of his body was buried at Westminster Abbey in London. The Africans loved David Livingstone. And then came the Black missionaries. So the British colonies of Sierra Leone and Nigeria. Now, I don't have a map here, but you can look on your map in your book on this. So the British colonies, those two British colonies had some great Black African missionaries. Granville Sharp helped many former slaves to colonize in the free town of Sierra Leone. So many former slaves came in and they made Sierra Leone a free town. And then the Church Missionary Society established 2 Christian schools there for evangelism and education. And we have this missionary here named Samuel Adjei Crowther, or Samuel Crowther, was the first Black bishop of the Church of England and the Church of Nigeria from 1864 to 1893. He was the first African pastor, let's just say that. He established a mission that was completely staffed by Africans. You know, so here we have the Africans taking over the mission field. How exciting. And then, of course, we have missionaries in Liberia. So Liberia was the most unique state in Africa ever, because it began as an idea for American colonization of society to repatriate the freed Black slaves to their African home. So what does this mean? It meant that Americans back then, they wanted to free these Black slaves that were brought over and sold in America and free them. And they said, if they want to go back to their homeland, we'll actually have this place that they could go back that would be safe. And so they started Liberia. So the dispatched first settlers were in 1822. And so some of the freed slaves went back to and started Monrovia, because it was under President Monroe. He's the first one that financed this whole thing to pay for this country. So Americans paid for the country and became the first independent African republic in 1847. So this was the first independent, the first country in Africa, you know, as for independent country, besides Ethiopia. So the first Christian missionaries to Liberia were 2 African-American ministries from the United States. So here we have a whole country that's based on missions and a whole country that's taking in freed slaves. Amazing. It's an amazing thing that America did too. Even though a lot of slaves that were set free didn't go back at that time. They didn't want to go back. They wanted to stay in America, but some did. And of course, it filled with missionaries. American missionaries in Liberia. So the missionaries, the Black missionaries, African origin missionaries were Lot Carey and Colin Teague. They came from America. So we have Lot Carey down here and Colin Teague. And they founded Monrovia's, remember, from President Monroe, who actually financed this whole situation. They founded Monrovia's first Baptist church. And the Liberians spread the gospel to other parts of Africa from Liberia. Liberia, the missionary country. And William Harris here was the most famous Liberian evangelist, and he preached on the Ivory Coast in 1913, and he preached when he was 60 years old. He started bringing the gospel to some of these dark areas of Africa. Commerce and colonization. So we're talking about Africa. Remember, all these countries started coming in then. Merchants bought legitimate commerce to the continent. They started purchasing things like palm oil, ivory, and woods to sell in Europe and America. So they're coming in for natural resources, right? And so Africa's wealth was mighty. They had gold, they had ivory, they had diamonds, and this made colonization extremely profitable. So a lot of these countries decided we need to come in here. They have they have diamonds, they have gold, they have other resources. This is very profitable. So this brought in a lot of, they're not explorers now, but they're merchants coming into the interior areas of Africa. And then other European powers came besides England and carved out their territory, colonizing and a lot of them brought in military and controlled with the military, including England. So they'd bring in their military and then they would control them. So it wasn't missions at that time. It was harsh for a lot of these Africans, which were very primitive peoples. In 1914, nearly 90% of Africa had been colonized. Of course, we have this tiny Liberia, the Free State we talked about, and this is Ethiopia, and all of the rest, 90% of Africa had been colonized by other countries. So here we have only 2 independent nations in Africa at this time. Okay, virtually every nation in Europe had colonies. So Great Britain had colonies, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. They all carved out what they wanted in Africa. And some regarded the Africans as a place to be exploited, and the people were nothing more than a source of cheap labor. So when they went in, they basically said, yeah, we'll just make these people work. And they didn't pay them. They just worked them to death, and made them slaves. And they were exploited. But others saw Africa as a land of needing the light of the gospel. And they went in and shared the good news in the gospel to these areas of land and helped these people to help themselves. South Africa and the Dutch. So I think I'll stop there and we'll finish up in the next video.